Hi, welcome to Quiet Before. My name is Nancy Bulalakaw. Today, we're going to be talking about the origin story of Praise Shadows Gallery in Boston. We're talking to the founder and two key artists from the start of the gallery, which I'm a huge fan. I've known Ing for many, many years now, so I'm very excited to be able to capture her thinking behind her groundbreaking gallery. Tell me if I'm wrong about this memory, but I think that you introduced to me your thinking around the name of the gallery as we were having afternoon tea at Baccarat Hotel.
Yeah.
I remember it like we were princesses.
It's like the only time I've ever had high tea. I mean, I think I've had it before, but that was other level high tea.
I mean, eating like pretty cakes, then hearing your thinking around why you would name your gallery after this book was really powerful. And to see how far you've come is really amazing. And
Thanks, Nancy. I
congratulations.
appreciate your support and for of all of us. Thank you.
If you could each quickly introduce yourselves and maybe where you are. I'm in Bristol, England.
I'm Yng-Ru Chen. I'm the founder and owner of Praise Shadows Art Gallery, and I am back in Boston. But just 24 hours ago, I was in the same time zone, more or less, as Yuri and James.
I'm James Clar. I am a media artist, light and video, and I'm now in Manila. But I was born in the States. I lived there in Wisconsin, and then I went to school in New York, and I lived 2 years in Tokyo, 6 years in Dubai, and then back to New York for 8 years. And then now, 2.5 years ago, I moved to Manila, where I'm now based.
Hi, I'm Birdfish. Well, I'm Yuri, Yuri Shimojo. I'm a painter. Birdfish was my tag name back in the days. I'm Yuri Shimojo. I'm an artist. I paint and write. And right now I'm speaking from Kyoto, but I usually live in New York City, East Village.
It's crazy that none of us are in New York right now, but that's how we all knew each
Yeah, I
other.
know. Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Ing, can you take us back maybe before afternoon tea to some of the circumstances that helped you decide that you wanted to start a gallery and have a physical space?
I started Praise Shadows in 2018 after having worked in many jobs in the arts. My first one was at a museum called the Asia Society, which is where I met you, Nancy. I did PR at PS1, and I worked at a design company where I licensed artworks from artists called Tatley. So I really had so many different experiences in the creative and mostly the fine art world. And by 2018, I was looking for a change, and I felt that I wanted to be my own boss. I had recently worked 4 years at that design startup called Tatley, and I learned a lot about artist royalties, licensing, and different kinds of entrepreneurship in the creative industry. I couldn't fathom going back into a museum environment at that point. I was really left alone in that last job to do whatever I needed to do to make my job succeed and help the company succeed. So I had a lot of autonomy, and the only path forward really seemed to just be create something else. Praise Shadows came about after a lot of soul searching, to be honest. It wasn't a gallery. I was still living in New York at that time, and we all know New York is full of galleries and doesn't necessarily need I didn't need that in my life. I didn't feel like I needed to put that out there. And I was working with artists such as Yuri and James, and like James was already working with a gallery in New York. It just didn't seem like that was where I needed to fit in. So I started Praise Shadows as a consultancy where I was working with artists to create opportunities beyond the art gallery model, the traditional model. And at that time, there had recently been a Whitney Biennial. I had connected with an artist who was in a recent biennial and was still searching for ways to create income. And then another artist, his gallery had suddenly closed. And so every once in a while, I would get these emails or calls or texts from artist friends just kind of asking for help. And I felt that there was something that should be done. So I thought about my time as a PR director, a marketing director, and signing all these licensing deals where I was helping artists create revenue in other ways. So Praise Shadows was founded in that framework. I took the name from a book called In Praise of Shadows by a Japanese author from the early part of the 20th century. He's a philosopher, Junichiro Tanizaki, and I had read the book in college, and it really transformed the way I had thought, because I was taught in a very Western mindset of learning about art history. And here, I was finally given a text that was teaching me about how Japan in the early 20th century was really, according to this philosopher, was contending with Western influences, looking at shadow as a very beautiful way of aesthetics in Asia, and particularly in Japan, and how important that was. And I kept thinking, there's always something in the shadows that we're not seeing. And I wanted to create stories from those shadows that the world or the art world wasn't seeing. And so that was 2018. I worked with Yuri, I worked with James and other artists. We did a pop-up exhibition in New York, but I was never intending on being a gallerist. 6 months before the COVID pandemic, I moved back to Boston, where I was raised. A lot of things happened, the George Floyd murder and COVID, and a lot of reassessment over the art world and, social practices. And I got to know Boston as a city better. I hadn't lived there as an adult. And I realized that there was a huge opportunity for the city and for the artists that I knew, and for this piece of real estate that I discovered to potentially make a gallery. That's a very short answer to how the gallery came about, but it was the least expected part of my path, because everything that Praise Shadow started as was a alternative to the gallery system. Now we have shows, we work with artists, and we obviously present their works, but we still do have a focus on, helping artists think outside of the box. We have artists that have been approached for deals and licensing or partnerships, and we can help them navigate that because of the experience that we've had.
Can you go back a little bit to the period of time post George Floyd and how that climate might have contributed to your thinking?
Because of my background in communications, and I was also helping and working with clients in comms in the early part of Praise Shadows, when George Floyd was murdered and all of the institutions and galleries, everybody was, having to really look at their diversity, equity, and inclusion and their messaging and their language. I found that I was doing that for either clients or organizations that I was involved with. And it was extremely mentally taxing for me, because I'm not white and I'm not Black. And so I was looked upon as this, I'm not saying that people said this to me, but I felt this, that I was kind of this middle entity that could help translate, or maybe like a safe space for some of these very pressured, feelings that were happening at that time in 2020. And so I was like helping some organizations, rewrite statements and really helping them think through. I would make recommendations, but ultimately I realized that these organizations and galleries or whatnot, I can't help them change, because I'm not part of their core structure. I didn't create their mission statement. I'm not even part of their leadership team. So it felt that, I was kind of just helping with a lot of surface messaging, which is what they wanted, but that felt uneasy to me. In my head, I kept saying, well, if I were them, I would have done it this way. Or if I were them, I would have done it this way. And after saying that so many times over the course of months and months, at some point I realized I needed to do something, or else I couldn't really exist in this art world anymore. There were so many upsetting things. Also, being Asian American and having my first job being at the Asian Society, I felt very strongly about Asian diaspora artists being seen. And I think we can, kind of talk about how it's changed for a lot of us. But back in 2018, 2019, early 2020, there was very little visibility. Kept thinking of all these artists who felt like they weren't really being wanted in a very general way just because they weren't in vogue. I was like, well, I know so many great Asian and Asian American artists that I would love to show. Maybe I'll show them, and that's, again, was another impetus for realizing that if I created my own space, that my point of view would be the gallery's point of view. And that was really exciting.
I'd like to come back to this point a little bit later on, but maybe if we could go to Yuri, could you talk about how you started working with Ing and your first experience with Praise Shadows?
Okay, well, I was very lucky. I am lucky person. Every day I feel that way, but meeting in changed everything. Probably when I met her, I was at the bottom of my life. I was already 50 something years old. I just realized, okay, I need to being an artist the rest of my life, but how? How can I make living with it? I have always painted since I remember, like childhood, but very early stage of my life, whole my family passed away. Before I become 30 years old, my father died, my mother died, my sister died. I became orphan. I was born and raised in Tokyo, and I was being illustrator and be on the TV shows and like subculture scene and media. And I was sort of like a party girl in Tokyo, but everything has changed because my life has changed. Long story short, I had a lot of things going on in Tokyo, my life, my marriage and everything, but I flipped the whole table and I came to New York. I spent all my 30s and 40s with life adventures. I spent money and passion and everything with adventure of life. I just wanted to find my identity. My family was very unconventional. I always tell this to people and people surprised. I'm the most conservative, normal person in my family. My father was a dentist who wanted to be a vaudeville comedian. My mother was a social butterfly, and I had a mentally handicapped sister who was 12 years older than me, and everybody died. I always kind of search for who I was, like a mirroring with other significant individuals. Then 30s and 40s, I kept searching for my identity outside of me, my relationship, where I lived. But then I ended up didn't have my child and family. When I met In, I was little over 50 and I lived in Kyoto after 3/11 tsunami. I missed Japan. I created this whole series called Memento Mori, which we talk later about life cycle. I lived in Kyoto for 3 years, but I missed diversity in New York. And I also felt being a professional fine artist, I really wanted to live in the midst of reality. Kyoto is beautiful and very inspiring, but I needed to have this sort of human rawness, which I missed in New York. Then I came back. Now I really want to focus on the life being a professional artist, but then how I spent everything with my adventures. 3 miracle things happened. 1, I found my home in New York City. 2, I found the best therapist. 3, I met Yin through our mutual friend. I had no idea who she was. I didn't know anything about art world because I always had a sort of phobia showing my work to people who is not my friends. I have always painted and I've always sort of exposed myself into some street culture scene here and there, but I was not really serious how to live with being an artist. That's how I met In.
Ing, can you talk a little bit about what that was like for you when you met Yuri?
Yuri invited me to her studio, which was a tiny room in the East Village, not where she currently lives, but another space. I had just started in Praise Shadows. So this mutual friend of ours said, we should meet. And I wasn't planning on, again, like selling the art. I was just meeting artists and trying to figure out who I wanted to work with and in what capacity. We had some very polite, conversation.
I was so nervous,
Yeah, I think we both were, like, what are we doing? She showed me these 5 gorgeous paintings, Memento Mori, which would become her masterpieces. I mean, they had already been painted, but they were just, shelved. You would have never known they were there. I was incredibly moved by seeing those. And then she told me the story of the creation of them, which again were made as a response to the tsunami and the earthquake in 2011. And then Yuri said to me, "Is your company named after the book In Praise of Shadows?" Nobody talked about that book. It was like there were very few people that could reference it. Right before that, I had been told, you can't name your company Praise Shadows. That like feels super religious and weird. And I was like, oh no, because I felt it in my heart that I wanted that name. But then when, especially like non-Asian people attributed the meaning of the company to something Catholic, I was like, okay, that's not where I want to go. And so when I met Yuri and she asked me if the company was named after the book by Tanizaki, and of course I said yes. And then she said, well, these 5 paintings, they were exhibited at the temple where Tanizaki is buried.
Wow.
That's in Kyoto.
So we both just started crying. It was okay, Yuri, I don't know what we're gonna do with this, but we're gonna know each other. We're going to talk. And she was still very much kind of in flux, even physically, right? Like Yuri didn't have a permanent home at the time. But over the next year or so, we would just meet and talk and, come up with ideas. Then it was Yuri who told me during this pop-up exhibition that both of them were in, that I randomly did and like very reluctantly did. I, exhibited several artists and Yuri's prints that she had for several years. We had put them on view and they sold. And she was so excited. And then I remember you said to me, Yuri, Ing, I want you to represent me. And I said, I have no idea, like how? I'm not going to have a gallery, but I'll help you try and make sales. So I really do credit Yuri with being the person that gave me the confidence, or even an inkling of doing this. Although other artists that I also work with now, like Duke Riley and Oliver Jeffers, when I open the gallery, because I've known them for 20 years, they're like, we told you to do this in 2005. I didn't remember because I literally never wanted to do this. Didn't just the thought of being a gallerist, because I came from the museum world, was so foreign to me.
What was the year of that studio visit?
I think it was 2018. It was like right when I started Praise Shadows. Yeah.
2018.
And then the pop-up exhibition,
It was 2019. So it was a year later.
where was that?
It was it was at this crazy mansion on the Upper East Side, designed by Robert Stern. This is postmodern mansion and the owners had never moved in. So the real estate developers asked someone that I knew if she could do a show. And so that was why she invited me to kind of collaborate with her. And so Yuri already had these gorgeous prints made. And then James and I will talk about how we met, but he had a studio in nearby in Jersey City and was represented by Jane Lombard Gallery. So he had inventory as well. And I just kind of called up artists that I, trusted and liked and said, I have this crazy space. Do you want to do something? So James installed this amazing installation in the dining room, this like empty, gorgeous Park Avenue dining room. That was 2019. And then later that year, I very suddenly decided to move to Boston with my family. So like all of these things happened really quickly, but I feel like I've known you guys forever. It's so weird to think that it's just been 2018.
James, can you talk about when you first met Ing, what led up to your meeting and how you've worked together a little bit prior to the gallery opening?
I don't remember the year, if it was 2018 or
It was
2017.
2018. I think it was early 20. I met you very early.
Yeah, you were still working at
2017.
Yeah, because you were a guest speaker
at
the
Manor.
residency that I was doing. And then after your talk, then you were kind of doing some studio visits. Ing came over to my studio. We just kind of hit it off right away. I think the communication was smooth and there was like a good energy, and she kind of saw what I was working on. And she was interested in these kind of alternate forms of like studio practice or ways to create sustainable studio practices that were outside of the gallery's reach. Galleries are really focused in terms of like how they function and how they sell things and, and how they do art fairs, all this kind of stuff. But there's like a lot of areas that aren't covered that this creative output of artists can go too, and
When I
so
was working
Ying
with
was like,
blockchain, so you
yeah,
have
you're
connected
working in
with blockchain.
blockchain. I get inquiries sometimes for my practice, and sometimes I don't know how to manage it. And so I think right away we already had some projects that we could work on together. I remember we went to Shanghai for a project there for some company that had commissioned me for an installation. That was like an amazing experience. And to have like somebody who was kind of like the communications, because she had already that experience with communications, she understands art. And then so she had this really great background experience. And even the fact that she was like resistant to becoming a gallerist kind of makes her an amazing gallerist and just like an amazing friend to artists, and like collectors like really believe in her because they know that she's not just like pushing works for sales, but she believes in the artist that she's working with. So it was like I almost felt like she kind of hesitantly was like
Totally.
the currents just kind of took her in that direction. She just went with it.
Thanks, James. I remember meeting James in the studio that first time. I had no idea that James was Asian American, right? Because like all I was given was his name, and I went on the website, of course, like awesome, amazing works. And then I was like, whoa, you're Asian, right? And I think again, because like that was my first job. And when I graduated from college, I've always loved fostering and helping to promote artists who are Asian or Asian American. I was like, this is really exciting. Also, I hadn't seen the kind of work that James does. I hadn't seen that before. He was working with new media, and I was really interested in expanding the ways that technology like blockchain could be a new media for artists too. And he was interested in that as well. So I just feel like we had so many conversations in those early
yeah. I
months.
mean, definitely the Asian American connection like already rooted us. Growing up in the States, we already kind of understood what that experience was like. Ing was really the first Asian American in the arts that I had connected with. Everyone else is just white or non-Asian. And they're of course like trying to push me to explore the Asian side of my identity, but Ing actually understood it.
I remember because I helped you write and do the PR for your solo show at Jane Lombard. I think that was 2019. We were writing your bio, and your bio didn't say that you were Asian American or Filipino American. And I remember discussing this with you. Do you want to tell people? You don't have to, but it wasn't clear to me when I saw your name, for example, this aspect of your identity. It's just so amazing to see. You're now like so in Manila. You're
immersed in it. I'm like really heavily immersed in it. And I mean, that was definitely like an initial push to have confidence and to try to embrace that side of me. In the past, I couldn't do that when I was in the States. I grew up in Wisconsin and I didn't have any exposure to the Philippines or a lot of Asians. So I had always neutralized that in the past. And I knew if I ever was going to explore that respectably or honestly, I had to move. Like I had to just move here to the Philippines to understand that.
James, can you talk a little bit about the past 2 or 3 years and how it's changed for you having the identity of being Asian American? What has that been like in terms of the narrative of your work?
It's definitely been fruitful, and I've been learning so much and experiencing so much, and being involved in like the art scene and being part of like dialogue of local arts here, which has been great. And people have been really supportive of that move. I had started coming to the Philippines maybe like 4 years ago before the pandemic. And every time I would come here, I would see how active it was and how much was going on. And it always kind of blew my mind that so much is happening here that just people aren't aware of in the States. And for somebody who's working in the arts to come here and see so much art happening, it was wild. I've always wanted to live in Asia. And I thought if I'm going to live in Asia, then of course I have to live in the Philippines. I have to kind of understand what that is from my own personal perspective. The pandemic happened. That first year was tumultuous, a lot of personal like change and trauma. I was in New York and I just kind of decided that I don't need to be there to make work anymore. And I had already been there for 15 years total. I needed a change. So I just kind of up and left and kind of settled down in Manila. New York is so amazing. I love going back there every time. I've already been there twice for shows this year. But I knew also like there's so many artists in New York. Everything's like covered in New York. And for my own personal growth and my own personal story and my own ideas, that is more important for me to not be there and experience things and then come back and share what I experienced and share what I learned. And I had been living I lived in Dubai for 6 years. I was heavily involved in the art scene there in New York. And, that whole section of the world and my own personal non-exposure to it was just glaring. And I I had to embrace it.
As an aside, do you know Christian Henson?
No.
He moved to the Philippines from New York maybe 3 or 4 years ago. You know Christian, right, Ing?
Because of John.
He started to do the visual identity for FAM. So
Oh, right.
he had a design collective called Hardworking Good Looking. He moved to the Philippines, and I mean, he's a fantastic designer and artist, and you should definitely connect
Yeah, I'd love
with.
to meet.
So, Ing, to go back a little bit and talk about Yuri and James's first time showing at Prey Shadows, the soup of all of that, COVID, George Floyd. Also, what does that mean that you wanted to represent Asian artists, and what's happened since then, kind of in the larger field?
First, I wanted to also just mention that Yuri and James were the first two people, and especially among the artists that I work with, to even see the space and to know about it. The two of them came to Boston. Yuri, I had set up like a little pop-up show at a gallery in Boston for some new work that Yuri had been making during the pandemic. And James was super kind to come. And this is August. So it was actually exactly 3 years ago. It was August 2020.
Oh, wow.
And, we didn't have the vaccines or anything yet. So it was like it meant a lot to me that you guys came, and, we were all taking kind of risks by being together. But, and I had just signed the lease in July. So they knew that this was happening, but it was such a crazy time. And I think, James, you hadn't yet moved to the Philippines, but you were like starting to make transition. You were staying at my place in Brooklyn. So, you were starting to make transitions to leave, and everyone's lives were kind of like, we don't know what's happening. But all I knew was like, guys, I'm doing something crazy. I just signed the lease. I'm going to open this gallery. And so I have a picture of the two of them in like the super raw space. We had just gutted it, and like, they're like masked or kind of masked and like jumping. It was just so cute. And I'll never forget that, because, also like when you see that picture and you see how disgusting the gallery looks then, compared to what we ended up making it look like. When I decided to open the gallery, I basically created like a pitch deck, not to like pitch for investors or anything. Like everything I've done is completely self-financed, which is why it's so incredibly hard. But I knew like, okay, this is like me, my vision, my relationships. We scheduled Yuri for a time slot to have her solo show. We had James within that same year for a solo show. And so obviously they wanted to come see the space. In the beginning, the artists that I showed were really just all people that I had previous relationships with from my time in New York. None of you guys were from Boston. So, coming here was also just kind of funny and strange. The first pandemic trip is to come to Boston and see this space. I didn't make a decision to just show Asian artists. That was never in the mission or any of the dialogue, but I did very much intentionally want to show Asian artists, but also to not make a big deal of it. I really felt that in the past, if like, a gallery showed 3 Black artists in a row, or 3 Latino artists in a row, or 3 Asian artists in a row, it would kind of be like, oh, are they like a Black owned gallery now? Or the Met can't just have like an all women's exhibition. You have to like make a point of why you're doing that. But you could have like an all white male exhibition and nobody blinks an eye. I remember like when James had his show, he was like the second show. There were 3 consecutive shows that fall, all by Asian American artists. All of them were so different, different media, different everything. It was like this way of trying to represent how diverse the field of being an Asian American artist is. No one can automatically assume that you're like the other, because again, you're just an artist. There are these similarities and these kind of roots that we can go back to and relate to one another with. But in terms of it as an artist's statement or being an artist, I wanted all of these artists just to feel that that show was for them, and it doesn't matter who they are. But what was really cool was that a lot of the collectors that started to pay attention to our program from the beginning were people who wanted to collect and get to know artists who were Asian or Asian American. We did end up having really wide, diverse group of collectors in the beginning, who I would say is not like what you would typically expect of a fine art gallery space, at least in 2020, early 2021. That was really exciting for me, because because I loved being able to ask a collector, thank you for your inquiry. Tell me about your interest or tell me about who you collect. And a lot of them would be like, well, I'm Asian American and I want to support this community and I'm very interested in these artists. Since then, it's amazing because there are artists in their 20s who just graduated from school and they're getting major exhibitions. The whole field of feeling like you're an art contemporary artist and being Asian or Asian American, and you're not siloed into showing at a museum or a space that is focused specifically on that feels really exciting. That just like was not the tone of the conversation in 2020.
Yuri, can you talk about your show at Praise Shadows and maybe how things were for you coming out of COVID and preparing for the show and how that experience was for you?
So my show, Memento Mori, I have painted, as Ayin had mentioned, that was our signature body of work that connected us. These 5 paintings, which is big mandala like circle that indicates life cycle. I have painted them after March 11th, 2011, Japan's earthquake and tsunami. I went through my personal life transition, big breakups, my family and country's gone. And so I was mourning, grieving. Then I learned this cherry blossom trees started to bloom in the middle of Deblis, the most affected area in Tohoku, Japan that time. It saved me. Wow. Nature, this whole power of rebuild themselves inspired us and humble human as we are the part of the nature, and also how we can forget about we are the part of this whole cycle of nature. So I started to paint this death, growth in between the spirit, birth, and self. That's the 5 theme of the works. Of course, they are the first paintings that I could face my own family's death. It was not just a response to Japan's earthquake. It was more about triggered to create something about death and life, which is beyond race and gender and everything. We all human, we are all the part of the nature, have to go through this life cycle. I also learned this kind of point of view is very Japanese, if not Asian. Sometimes death is taboo to talk in Western culture. It's not because I have experienced death a lot in my life. We talk a lot about death in our daily lives in Japan, in our culture. And that was the big theme of Tanizaki's in Praise of Shadow. When In had let me have a show of Memento Mori, that just happened to be the 10th anniversary. This Memento Mori had shown only in Japan 2013 and 14, but somehow every year it starts on March 11th.
Crazy.
And
I remember I said to Yuri, I was like, you have 2 options for dates. One is March, and I didn't know, and one is March 11th. And she said, you know, that's the 10th anniversary of the earthquake and tsunami. And that
Wow.
was when that happened. Yeah.
yeah, this kind of serendipity or synchronicity happens a lot in my life. That's how I always connected with, I cannot see my family, but everybody protects me. Painting is always my tool to communicate with the other side of lives. So I believe in the invisible. I can say spirit, but not only spiritual realm, but also unspoken words, anything invisible. Memento Mori is something that I always wanted to share about that spirituality and my understanding of impermanence. That was, of course, in the midst of COVID. It was actually perfect timing, not only the 10th anniversary of Japan's earthquake, but also we could mourn about each individuals after we experienced so many deaths in our 2020 through 2021. We sometimes get numb. So many numbers we see on the news. It's like when we embrace this beautiful cherry blossom petals, like sakuras, so many petals are dancing in the wind, but if we see each petals, which is each lives, that's something I wanted to share. I created this installation piece, which Yin had created this space as a sort of a meditational practice. But that time we still couldn't have more than 6 people in the room, less than 10 people. We couldn't have an opening, but my show at In Space became very personal for people who came, literally crawled out from their own COVID lockdown. People say this is the first time I saw in many months. I have this little notebook so that the people can express how they felt. My work is very personal. Everybody wants to share something not really discussing or not able to really digest yet, like a processing, but they could write how they felt, how they experienced in this amazing sort of confessions in this notebook, which gifted me. The show that Yin created was, again, I don't really categorize by race, but I didn't want my aesthetics or memento mori, the spirituality is not this typical sort of Japaneseness, but Yin had brought introducing my work into very universal conversation, which I've always needed to have.
It was really amazing, and it provided so much comfort to people at a really hard time. She received amazing press from it. We had collectors wanting to buy specific paintings. There were only 5. I really felt like they belonged together. I wanted them to try and stay together as opposed to having 5 dispersed throughout the country or the world. And this is March 2021. So we were still in the thick of the pandemic. I had just opened the gallery 3 months before, but the press reception was so strong, and the visitorship and the curators who came were so strong. And I'm super proud to say that we basically held off on the collectors. And I said, I want to sell this to one person if possible, so that we can try and keep this together. And we succeeded in doing that, so that was really amazing. I mean, we sold 4 to one main collector, and he said, the 5th one, I don't have room in my house, but my dear friend is a practicing Buddhist and is really connecting with this one. So then the friend who lives in the same city collected the other one. So they're still more or less in the same place. The goal is to bring Memento Mori back again in many iterations in the future, so that the public can appreciate it and enjoy it again and again. We also made limited edition prints from a few of the paintings. And the Boston Public Library just acquired one of them for their permanent collection, which is, really amazing. But these are dialogues and conversations that have taken years, right? It's the curator who met Yuri in 2021 and over time just realized, like, okay, we really need this to be embodied in our permanent collection. So it's just made like a huge difference to so many people. And I expect that it will continue to do so long beyond our lifetimes, I think.
I don't know if you saw in my Instagram posting, but we were in London like 2 weeks ago. We went into a bookstore just to kill time before we were getting picked up. The book was a staff pick.
Oh.
And it was like on the first shelf when we walked in. The staff note was, in this book, you'll read the most exquisite description of a toilet ever to exist.
How Japanese is that, right? It's so Japanese.
I mean, it really feels, Yuri, like you have been channeling messages to Ing for a few years now. And it sounds like such an important and fruitful relationship. James, can you talk about your show with Praise Shadows? And again, if you can speak a little bit about your process emerging from COVID and how that was for you in creating your show for the gallery.
After I had moved to Manila, then I came back the summer after and started putting together the show. It was during the summer, end of summer.
Your show opened in October. No, I think it was October.
I think I went to New York in like end of summer to start.
You finished the work in New York and then came to Boston.
Yeah, and then came to Boston. The show was called Folded Space. You know, a lot of the exhibitions that I do also kind of reference my travels. And so I had just kind of felt like, you know, Folded Space is these kind of folded maps and then traveling from one plane to the next. A lot of the works is also technology based, but I kind of infuse a lot of kind of personal narrative into the works that I do. My background was film. I'm interested in using kind of technology for storytelling to communicate kind of like an emotion or a concept or an idea. So we had like some light works in there. We had this video piece that I had filmed in Manila during the pandemic lockdown, which is using a laser projector and then animation of a dog running. We drove around the city in Manila and then projected onto the city the animation of the dog running and then recorded it from the perspective of the laser. So it kind of overlapped this kind of virtual dog with the real space and the real city. Like we can't do that anymore because the city's so crowded and there's so much traffic. So really the only period that we could have done it was in that 2-month period where everything was kind of locked down. So it's interesting to see Manila in this kind of desolate space. The only thing that's running around is kind of this like virtual dog. You know, we had a couple of pieces which is like using light works, kind of describing people being thrown in different directions or trajectories of like people, like kind of momentum of people moving. We had a performance in the space too to kind of close the exhibition.
James, you were so excited because the show was where you started working with the new light source, the light materials that, you know, you've now been using a lot more. It was kind of this turning point in terms of your material making.
You know, I've been doing kind of these wall-based light pieces since the time I was in Dubai. So like since like 2009. As the technology evolves, then it allows for kind of different techniques or different kind of aesthetics to be created from it. These new light pieces that I'm doing that started with that show in Boston is that you know, I'm using the fixtures to kind of emit the light and they're just spreading on the wall. And then I'm using the fixtures themselves to kind of block off certain areas. So the light really gets trapped within certain geometries and it creates these kind of more sharper edges of light. You know, if you see neon pieces or word pieces on the wall, oftentimes the light is just kind of spreading around. But what I figured out is that I can actually control geometric shapes of color. Yeah, I mean, that kind of also like kind of ties back to film and theater, where it's just light bouncing off the screen. But I have kind of more control over that. That's kind of the aesthetic that I've been evolving since that time.
Yng, do you have a sense or conversations with kind of your peers, other gallerists about, I mean, how things have evolved post-COVID and maybe even how all three of you feel Praise Shadows is different? I know your relationships with Yng, how you started and that she sort of found these in-between spaces and that really has gone on to inform what the gallery is. But do you have thoughts on the state of affairs in terms of galleries and representation and where Praise Shadows fits in all of that?
I think I'm in a really unique literal position because I'm not in New York, I'm not in LA. I'm in a city that has a wealth and abundance of art, but is not a mecca. It's not where people go to get their art fill in per se. You should. There are so many outstanding museums. I think, James, like on your opening day, there were like 6 curators that showed up early and on time to see your work. I remember James was just like, whoa, this never happens in New York. The head of contemporary from the MFA Boston like did a private tour with James with his baby and a baby born. And there's just so much of this innate, not just curiosity, but active learning from artists here in Boston. I think because it's such an academic town, we've just cultivated so many great relationships with curators and the museums that would have never happened in New York or LA. There's so many galleries in those other cities that like curators just don't have time to go see most things. In our case, oftentimes our shows, you know, if you go to an opening, every single museum is represented in our space. That just feels really good. It feels like, you know, we have a lot of support, but also the museums, you know, they actively tell me this. They're just grateful that they have us because we're bringing in artists like James and Yuri who don't live here, especially for James, like he's in Manila. There aren't many galleries, if any, in Boston that are bringing artists from places like Manila to have solo shows here. I feel super fortunate because I just have these extended relationships with the two of you and with more of the artists. And I can ask artists to have a show and to consider it. And in the beginning was based purely on my relationships. They trusted me or they knew me and so said yes. I would always have to make a case for it. You've never shown in Boston. Neither of you had shown in Boston, I don't think, before Praise Shadows. And now like everyone in Boston knows who the two of you are. Yuri came back in May recently. Just the difference between the first time she was here to this past May, it was amazing. She basically had like fans and people who had only seen her work in 2021. I do think that the conversation in terms of, I'm definitely a younger emerging gallery because we've only been around for less than 3 years, but we're able to go to really great art fairs. We've gotten great press, we've made great museum acquisitions happen. I feel like we're not really a Boston gallery at the same time. Like, even though we're physically located here, people often tell me, I was in Venice and somebody was wearing your Praise Shadows hat. In Hong Kong, a good friend who recently met Yuri is now a huge fan, is like wearing the Praise Shadows hat. Our reach is global, just as the projects that I always intended to do pre-gallery days was always meant to be global. James and I going to Shanghai, and then we went to Beijing. We are living in the United States, but the art world is not a New York centric place. I always wanted to do something that was not defined by this like physicality of being in New York. But a lot has changed. And I think with the pandemic, everything had to be online anyway. So we were able to kind of cross over to a lot of different audiences. We consigned a work from James's gallery in Manila, that video work. I love working with different galleries as well. If you have a good gallery, really the goal is to work together to expand visibility of your artists. I don't want to feel and be and act territorial over things because, again, like if it's a good partnership with an artist and then there's another institution or a gallery that's a good partnership for this artist, then those things should be made possible. The dialogue around identity, and it's just so ever shifting. When I first opened the gallery, figurative painting was the huge thing. Then the last round of art fairs, I was told, and you could see like the people who selected galleries and artworks for art fairs did not want all figurative paintings anymore. It just keeps going up and down. And for me, the whole point of working with artists is that I want them to have very long careers. I want as well for me to have a long career. So it's not just about like flash and burn. It's creating something more sustainable, really making sure that everyone is in a good place, feeling taken care of, and feeling energized and excited about what they can do. But our lives are ever changing. The political climate is ever changing too. There's no guarantee of success. A lot of people have also said to me like, oh, you should move to New York. You should move to another city. I just feel like that wouldn't serve me any purpose. We have a great community here. And the fact that we can bring artists like Yuri and James to be shown here is great for everybody.
The gallery is so young, and yet you've accomplished so much. And I think that that seems to be driven by how the gallery was born. It feels like Yuri and James represent parts of you that have made Praise Shadows so unique. The spiritual with the technology, being open to the signs, but also being very fastidious and thorough about your relationships and how you connect with people.
Even just thinking, not even about identity, like James, the fact that James and I were talking back in 2018 about blockchain as a laboratory for art, and like we had conceptualized some ideas, not necessarily, I had been advising another company at that time as well. But look what's happened to blockchain. Like NFTs became this huge market and then it's already crashed. And I was never like, we were never in it to like mint NFTs and get rich. It was always, how do we make better art? How do we continue? Like just even in our very early conversation about your AI assistant, right? And I could see James's brain being like, oh my God. But that's what's really cool. I'm not an artist, but I love having that dialogue with artists to, like, okay, what crazy ideas are you thinking? How can we help make something like that possible?
Before we wrap up, can you all share what's coming up for you? We can start with James.
I had the solo in New York this spring, and then also I curated a show of Filipino artists. So I brought 12 Filipino artists over to New York and then showed them there.
Congratulations, by the way. That was
thanks.
so amazing.
It was a great project, and it was a great way to kind of also like integrate myself into the art scene here and have a lot of conversations with artists and kind of learn about their practice. Coming up, I'm going to go to Seoul next month for Freeze. And then next year, there's some shows lining up, I think in the fall.
Where was the show that you curated in New York?
It was at Jane Lombard Gallery, and then the solos with Silver Lens Gallery, their new space in Chelsea. That was my first time curating a show. It was interesting to kind of put together an exhibition and then think about like the narratives that you're communicating and the stories through other people's work. It was a really interesting exercise because it's like the puzzle pieces aren't your own works, it's like somebody else's work. Also, like that solo show or the shows that I had done here, like I did a solo in Manila, and then I did Ing show, and then I had a solo in New York. These were all like exploring the process of me moving to Manila and understanding what Philippine identity is. So then the curated show was kind of the flip of that, where I'm trying to understand what Philippine identity is through other people's works. So it kind of created this kind of shell or like circular vision of the different processes and concepts and like issues that artists here deal with.
James, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Now that you've lived in Manila for a couple of years, do you think about the Asian American side of your narrative anymore? Or do you feel just more Filipino?
When I moved here, I was very aware of coming in as like an outsider and as like an Asian American. Diaspora Filipino experience is so different from like a local Filipino experience, and like the issues that we deal with in the States as like Filipinos or as Asian Americans are so radically different from what like the issues that they deal with here. My cousin from LA was here a couple weeks ago, and then she's talking about being Asian or being Filipino American in LA, and I was like, wow, I feel a little distance from those issues a little bit, because I'm now dealing like on the ground like different issues like here. What was interesting with the show in New York, the curated show, is that I think a lot of people also they were surprised that the content, the mediums that artists were working with here, it's just like a black hole, a mystery of what people perceive the Philippines to be and what people perceive contemporary Filipino art to be. Nobody in the States knows it. Nobody really is exposed to it. Thankfully, like working with you or with Silver Lens or Jane Lombard Gallery and these guys, like bringing that stuff over, it's definitely exposed a lot of new content and new ideas and new artists to the Western art scene.
I was just in Hong Kong and I met with a collector who did buy a work by an Asian American artist from me, but he's Hong Kong. He's not American at all. And I asked him if he is interested in Asian American stories or narratives. And he's like, not really. I was in Hong Kong in 2019 as the protests were happening, the pro-democracy protests. And so, there's a lot to contend with there. So then like they're looking at these Asian American issues and it's obviously not top of mind. There is this very interesting parallels of artists who are working in these same disciplines, but their narratives aren't really aligning. You have like Susan Chen, who I'm very close with and is making great paintings about being Asian American. Then you have artists in Asia who just like, that's like not their awareness at all, because there's so many other things that are really essential and important for them that they want to discover. It's not ever going to be a monolith. Being an artist who is of the Asian diaspora, it means something, but it doesn't mean all that much ultimately, across all the different spectrums, because we're having completely different experiences. Yuri has made a point several times because people have in her bio written Asian American, and she's like, I'm not Asian American, even though Yuri lived in New York for decades. Yeah.
I am Japanese New Yorker. I'm not Japanese American. Even when I come back to Japan, definitely I feel outsider here, but in the point of view of New Yorker. And I have lived only in New York and Hawaii. So those two very unique places, which is very not the America. Every time I think of Japanese American or Asian American, I'm like, what is American? I can talk about New Yorker point of view, or I can talk about like Hawaiian, like a local point of view, but I am Japanese descendant, cosmopolitan or universal, just human being. And I want to keep this way. I really want to kind of add something about being so lucky working within. I love being this community. Since I always always had this sort of fear. Oh, this art world scary, and then this gallery. You cannot trust this, and competitive. They are definitely, but we kind of trust each other. How In had selected artists. Of course, In chose their works, but In definitely selected this community as how they are the real human, how they really good people. I love hanging out with In and other artists like Duke and Oliver. And the other day we had so much fun. I always feel when people approach us, we kind of share the great vibes that we have. I feel very proud of being in this community. And definitely, it's not just a gallery, this whole community that is sort of infestated. And I love this.
I remember like you cooked for me and James, I think, before we all left New
Oh,
York.
that's
I think
right.
that, like, a
I
really
love cooking for other people. And yeah.
it's not just business. It's such a part of my day-to-day life. So I have to enjoy and respect and like working with the people that I end up working with.
I couldn't have made it through the pandemic without Yng and Yuri and the conversations that we had, and also, yeah, I mean, the support that they gave me to get through all that stuff. So, I mean, it's
So,
more than just like
so
work,
do
it's
I.
really these personal conversations and just like caring for each other on a personal level.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, if I don't have a gallery someday, I'll have you guys, I'll have the relationships. And I also just want to like shout out to Nancy too. I mean, Nancy, you've been, I've known you for so long, but even, when Paul Pfeiffer did the talk with you, James, that was because of Nancy. I reached out to her and then she reached out to Paul. And I feel like we're always looking out for each other and checking in, like, just making sure that things are okay. I mean, life is really tough, and the last few years have been extremely challenging. James, you are just doing so well, and you've made this incredible community happen in Manila. And I want to see your next curated show.
I'm kind of retired.
We have to get to what Yuri's doing next.
Talking about supporting each other, I had been through cancer treatment last 2 years. Right after I had a show at Memento Mori show, March through April 2021, May, my soul dog had diagnosed cancer. He was old and 13, but we canceled everything. My planning to go back to Japan because I wanted to be with my dog. But then I went my health checkup because I have time. I canceled my trip. Then I found my early stage of breast cancer. I had been through chemotherapy and radiation treatment and a lot. Duke and Ian and shaved my head. That was when? September 2021. Now my hair is back. I am definitely recovering from my dog. He made it almost 2 years. He just passed this year at the end of my treatment. In had gave me another opportunity for my next solo show, which was supposed to be end of this year. But I had to beg her. In, I think I still digesting. So my next solo show at Praise Shadow, it's going to be October in 2024. I think I might gonna do a tiny little show in Kyoto while I'm here before fall. I'm here to sort of organize my family stuff, time to sort of digest a lot of things of my personal life. Then I go back to New York at the end of this year, then start from there. In the middle of pandemic, while I was going through my cancer treatment, I had opportunity to be in this documentary film called The Color of Ink, which is about ink and this Toronto ink maker called Jason Logan. And it's a documentary film made in Canada, which is not being shown in US yet, but should be next year or sometimes this year.
Thanks, Yuri. And your hair looks amazing.
Yay. I had like afro for a while.
Ing, if you could close us out with talking about maybe what you wish long term, what are your dreams for Praise Shadows?
You know, the gallery came about with no pre-planning. It just kind of happened on a switch. They're very practical things. We're not yet at the end of my 5-year lease, but at some point I have to discuss my lease with my landlord. We're in a great place right now with the gallery. My staff is amazing. I just want to continue to grow, not necessarily with more square footage. There's been a lot in the news like this past week about galleries closing in New York or galleries not paying their artists and being sued. Literally, I think there's been like 3 or 4 articles this past week. When I opened and during the pandemic, the market was actually really hot. People were spending money on art. And this past year has affected some of these spaces, which I think took risks to grow over the last 2 years. There's a gallery in New York that I respect highly that just is suddenly closing in August. Things like that really give me pause and caution. The art world, it's kind of like a parallel to the general economy and the state of affairs in our society. You have the huge mega galleries that have seemingly infinite resources, and then small galleries that are really sometimes having to struggle, but then in order to compete, they have to take risks by getting bigger and then kind of over leveraging. So I don't want to do that. I don't want to feel like I need to open another space just because people feel like you have to. It's like museums expanding and you're kind of thinking, well, is that why you're charging me $30 for an entrance fee at your museum now? Which is just insane, you know, like having just been in Taipei for the last month, I mean, I didn't spend more than $1 in going to any museums. And now I'm coming back to the US where like the Whitney and the Guggenheim are $30 for general admission. I want to actually be conservative in how we approach any idea or notion of growth. I think the growth really has to be with the artists and the fact that we can work with artists on more like institutional programs and obviously growing the collector base. We are, you know, doing more art fairs. So we're doing the Armory show and a concurrent show called Photo Fairs in September. And that's already stretching our capacity in terms of staff and all of our resources. Being an individually financed company, I have to make really hard decisions sometimes and do the things that are going to allow us to sustain ourselves and survive. I just want to be able to continue what we're doing and not necessarily feel like we have to compete with the gallery next door or whatever. And I think that's, again, the benefit of not being in New York is I don't feel that at all. I feel like we can really just be left alone and do what's best for us and for the artists that we show. Hopefully that stays the case for a while. You know, I'd love to be able to show our artists in Asia more. That was part of my trip this past month in Taipei and Hong Kong, is just really having those conversations and reconnecting with folks there after not being there for several years and understanding what the collector base is like there and what showing there and bringing art there is like, and what we need to do to succeed in those ways.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for making this happen.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you, Nancy.
I look forward to revisiting this story in a few years and seeing where you all are at. But, you know, congratulations. I think what you're all doing is very different. And it is, you know, in essence, building community in such a conscientious and thoughtful way. So I love it. I've loved Ing since
2002.
2003, I think,
2003.
in front of the MoMA. I really respect what you're doing, and I'm so glad to have learned about Yuri and James because of your work. Thank you all.
See, I'm so Japanese.
I know.
I've never be American. I mean, well, I am New Yorker, but still very Japanese. Thank you, domo arigato.
How would you sign off in Manila, James?
We just say goodbye,
Bye.
paalam.
What do you
Ingat.
say?
Ingat ka. It's
Ingat.
like see you later or paalam, goodbye.
Ingat ka.
Ingat ka.
Ingat ka, paalam. Salamat.
再见.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Nancy.